Oh, hi, it's Cindy. So today we are happy to introduce you to one of our favorite podcasts by sharing an episode in our feed. Why We Write features conversations between folk music reporter Kim Ruehl and a handpicked array of great singer-songwriters presented by Folk Alley. So much goes into a song, the songwriter's intimate life, their upbringing, their worldview, what they see going on in the world. So what moves them to put pen to paper? How do they do it? Kim explores all of this with some of the finest songwriters working these days, old favorites, up-and-comers, and everything in between. Kim is one of my favorite music writers and frankly, one of my favorite people. Her laid-back demeanor is easy to vibe with and does well for her scholarly approach. Kim is basically a folk-brainiac and cannot be stopped. I first met her while she was the editor-in-chief at No Depression. She's since gone on to publish her first book, A Singing Army, Zilphia Horton and the Highlander Folk School. A former singer-songwriter herself, Kim not only brings her big writer's brain and cool attitude into these conversations, but she has a unique musician's perspective that her guests can feel and relate to. Basic Folk is pleased to share Kim's interview with Rosanne Cash. This episode was originally published on June 9th, 2021. Hope you enjoy Kim's conversation with Rosanne Cash and get into the other episodes of Why We Write, which you can find wherever you get podcasts, or you can check it out at folkalley.com. Here's Kim and Why We Write.
Hello, my name is Kim Ruehl, and you're listening to the Why We Write podcast, brought to you by Folk Alley. For this episode, I got the chance to talk about the why and how of songwriting with one of my personal favorites, Rosanne Cash. Rosanne's career has spanned more than 4 decades and included 11 number 1 hits. I personally love her songwriting because of the literary vibe that comes through it. This has been especially true in more recent years, as she's been collaborating with her husband John Leventhal and turning out stunning songwriting on award-winning songs like A Feather's Not a Bird and 8 Gods of Harlem from her She Remembers Everything album. In fact, Rosanne Cash is a gifted storyteller in general. She writes a lot more than just songs. Her articles and essays and her memoir, Composed, are written in a voice that is equal parts poetry and a sort of gentle but assertive candor. Reading what she's written, you get the feeling she understands the world in a way that most of us don't. I couldn't help but wonder if she writes primarily to understand it even better. So that's where our recent conversation began. I hope you enjoy listening to Rosanne Cash talking about why she writes. I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship of music and place. You've lived in some places where musicians flock to these cities, in Nashville and New York and Memphis. Do you write differently in Nashville than you do in New York?
Yeah, you're talking place and geography, both context and content. And when I write about a place or I name drop a city, it has a certain resonance to me. I mean, Memphis has reverberates with everything Memphis is, the hot stew that Memphis has always been. And like in a song John and I wrote, Modern Blue, my lyric about Barcelona and ending up back in Memphis, I had just been to Barcelona and it was just so rich and layered and feeling and food and architecture. And then Memphis, such a contrast. And I started thinking, well, has anybody put Barcelona and Memphis in the same song? And if they did, it was probably Dylan, but I don't think so. So I was kind of proud of myself for doing that. But these places resonate, like in A Feather's Not a Bird, starting in Florence, Alabama, and then through the strongest shoals, which is Muscle Shoals, and on to Arkansas. I mean, that's an urgent journey through the South, and each place has its own feeling and history. And then for context, different places do inspire different kinds of songs. I wrote my song, the lyrics to 7th Avenue, when I lived on 7th Avenue in New York City. I couldn't have written that if I'd lived anywhere else. And all the songs on The River and the Thread were either written in the South or inspired by trips to the South. So, yeah, in 7 Year Ache, I wrote, after having a fight with my then husband on Ventura Boulevard and, thinking about the boulevard and what that means and feels like. I do love geography, and I love putting a sense of place and time in a lyric. It just makes it come alive, and there's just, like I said, particular resonance to each place.
Yeah, and Americana, roots music, whatever you want to call it, is very tied to America. Regionally, there's just different sounds and different flavors you get along the Mississippi Delta, different in Los Angeles, different, in New York. You seem to tap into that very frequently and easily.
Well, I try to tap into it frequently. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, and sometimes it requires, being in a place and soaking it up. And Memphis is really powerful to me. I was born in Memphis, and Sun Records is still there. Stax Records is still there. The Lorraine Motel, where Martin Luther King was shot. The old Peabody Hotel, Memphis College of Art, which is now closed. But, Elvis's house, the house I lived in when I was born. I mean, those are powerful spots to me. And it's almost impossible to avoid some kind of imprint that leads to a lyric.
Yeah. Well, and thinking of not to stay too long on The River and the Thread, but the Sunken Lands, you talk about cans of paint, and it seems like place is sort of an avenue into a story for you as well, to think of yourself in that context or think of somebody in that context.
Yeah, and now the things I'm writing too, I just wrote a song with Matt Berninger of The National, and he and I had a discussion about place and our pasts before we wrote the song, about talking about the South and the legacy of the South and the pain of the South and how to resolve that in yourself. I mean, that was a real conversation we had, and then wrote the song together. So the visceral qualities of a place, I mean, you can drive across America now and it can be a string of McDonald's to you, if that's all you're looking for. Or you can soak up the history and the, like my song Night School, the magnolia trees and the Civil War battlefields, and how the air is just wet with heat, so heavy. I just try to pay attention.
Do you think of yourself as a Southern writer?
Not totally, although sometimes I want to think of myself as a Southern writer. I'm reading Eudora Welty right now again, and just think, oh God, I want to be that specific, about place and time. I'm a hybrid though, I grew up in Southern California. I've been a New Yorker for 30 years, was born in the South, but I've actually lived less in the South than I did in California or New York. Still, my DNA, both of my parents were Southerners. I understand the South and Southern people, if that's not too much of a generality. And there's so much I love about it. And the older I get, the more I feel an urgency to tap into whatever that means as a writer.
Yeah. I've been watching The Crown. Have you watched?
Oh, yeah. I'm obsessed with The Crown.
Totally obsessed. But I've been thinking about, the theme that's so accessible is the idea of family and the responsibility we have to the people who came before us, people who come after us. And thinking of your family, this line of writers and musicians, your dad, obviously, your kids as well, your husband. You are an individual songwriter, very much do your own thing, but how does all of that enter the room when you're writing, or does it? Do you feel like a responsibility artistically to both sides of that?
There are ghosts in the room when I write, oftentimes. And, it's a temptation to get sucked down the rabbit hole of the past and legacy and ancestral history and unresolved suffering, unresolved prejudices. Sometimes I even feel a responsibility about breaking the chain. When writing The River and the Thread, I started to realize that you have to cut some threads and cherish others, and the ones you cut are equally as valuable, making that decision. But sometimes I do get obsessed with writing out a certain theme until it's done. And apparently there are things that are not done, because the newest song I wrote is called The Killing Fields, and it's about lynchings in the South and the shame and degradation and unresolved trauma of that for Southerners on both sides, black and white, equal participation. I mean, there's this organization in Arkansas I support because it's called the Memorial for Peace and Justice Movement. And I think the reason it's called movement is because it brings to the table the descendants of those who were lynched and the descendants of those who participated in it, to try to reconcile. And I mean, that's a really powerful thing. And sometimes I feel like I'm trying to do that in myself, my racist grandfather, my woke children, and I cutting the threads. So, yeah, sometimes they're in the room, sometimes they're ghosts, sometimes they're inspiration, sometimes I'm just writing something until I can get rid of it.
Do you often start a song thinking it's about one thing, and then after maybe even a couple years of playing it, you realize, oh, this is totally something else?
Or while writing it, too.
Yeah.
I like The Killing Fields starts out with John, my husband, in Brooklyn and me in California. And I thought that's what I was writing about. And then suddenly I went down this hole of the South and my own history in the South, and then came back up to say, we are not who we were then. So yeah, sometimes it's like a painting that you don't know where it's going, and then it ends up being an abstract rather than a portrait, or vice versa. But yeah, sometimes after 30 years of singing something, I realized it wasn't about anger, it was about hurt, or it wasn't about partying, it was about torment.
Which is, life lessons, just, that's how age
development.
goes.
It's development, yeah.
Speaking of John, I'm fascinated by couples who work together, because I think very few can do it and still like each other, especially creatively. How does that work? Do you just come to him with a mostly finished song, or?
It works always. And I think the reason that it still works is we're not very modern in that way that people who are married can spend a lot of time apart and make it work. Neither one of us is like that. We like being together most of the time. And if we didn't, we wouldn't have survived, because we were on the road together, in the studio together, raising children together, a house together. We're just not apart. I just spent 6 weeks away from him. My daughter had a baby, and I went down and quarantined for 2 weeks and then moved into her house and everything. That was the longest John and I have ever been away from each other, and it was disconcerting. I felt untethered from the earth. And I think he did as well. But creatively, we sometimes are in conflict. I mean, we've had terrible fights about songs or recording or how something should be phrased or arranged or voiced. And we've also had moments of real transcendence with each other in creating something. And it works in all ways. Sometimes I have a partial lyric. He says, "Do you have anything?" I have a partial lyric. I give it to him. He starts writing the music. I kind of see where it's going. I finish the lyric. Sometimes I have a complete lyric. Sometimes he comes to me with a melody. When we write together, we still write separately as well.
So is it something that you'll work on together for weeks, or do you ever just sit down and say, okay, we're going to write this thing?
Well, sometimes months, sometimes years. There's a song that I just finished the lyric for called Sparrow in the Falling Rain, and he just finished recording himself because he's making an album of his own music right now. And I've had that Sparrow in the Falling Rain for probably 2 years in my iPhone, a partial lyric. And then when he said, "I'm going to record this," then I had to finish the lyrics for him.
Yeah. So how, for people that don't write, who might be listening to this, how does that process work to come up with a 3 to 5 minute song over the course of years? What does that look like?
Well, obviously I save lyrics, and I have multiple ways of saving them on my phone, on my computer, and massive numbers of notebooks. And sometimes I find scraps of paper. I just found one in my date book that I had stuffed in there a long time ago, which is really disorganized. But I'm not one of those people who has a perfectly neat desk and everything is, it kind of drives John crazy because he is like that. But yeah, my song Rules of Travel, I had that chorus for 8 years. And I knew it was a really good chorus, but I had no idea what the lyrics should be until we started making the album, or we're close to making the album. And then something happened in my life that I knew how to write the lyrics. I can't even remember what it was. But maybe sometimes it's waiting for that, a little water to be thrown on the plant. I don't know. I mean, I sometimes am guest teacher in songwriting classes, and I tell young people, never get rid of your old lyrics. Put them in a file, save them. You can come back to them. Sometimes I'll be working on something and I'll get stuck, and I go through files of old lyrics and I find something that makes no sense, but somehow it works, and marry things together. I did that with my song, World of Strange Design. It was like 2 completely separate parts lyrics, and I put them together.
Nice. Has that changed much over the years, or do you feel like you trust the process more now than you did when you were younger?
Well, one thing is that I have a lot more unfinished lyrics in files over the years. But yeah, of course, I trust the process more. I mean, don't you, Kim? After doing it for a certain number of years, you, even though you're still insecure, like, I don't know where this is going. Oh, I'll never do another good one again. You trust that is in itself is part of the process. The insecurity, the confusion, then the light at the end of the tunnel, then, the editing. I used to not be as comfortable with ambiguity, not as comfortable as I am now. Because life is ambiguous, it's not clear cut. It's not all about broken hearts and your broken heart staying that way. I mean, that's what I wrote about when I was young, pain and how it just stayed that way. It doesn't stay that way, and neither does the other half of it. Neither does contentment. It's like Rilke said, you have to love the questions. I think I love the questions a lot more than I used to. I'm more content with not having an answer.
Yeah, I think, that's just comes with age, and, over time you sort of develop a better relationship with yourself. Do you feel like there's certain themes that you've been chasing all this time? Like the idea of, like, getting to the center of a question that you had when you were younger or whatever that you keep writing toward?
I think there's one question, and it's who am I? Who am I? What do I think? What do I feel? And sometimes you don't know until you write it. And it's like uncovering tiny pieces all through your entire life, you know? And writing about an imagined future or an imagined past, you know, because our memories are not accurate all the time, and trying to organize the pieces of yourself so that it makes sense to yourself. I mean, and I think that we all have this compelling need to let our voice be heard. I always think about this philosopher I read back in the 80s, Carolyn Heilbrunn, and she said that women need to live their lives in the public sphere just to balance out the millennia of male lives that were lived in the public sphere. So a lot of times when I've been afraid to say it in a song or in prose or in anything, I think of that. Like, well, I'm just helping balance things.
I've never talked to anybody in a creative job who doesn't struggle with, self-doubt or some sort of, imposter syndrome or whatever. Like, I think the most successful people find a way to use that or
absolutely.
How have you learned to deal with that?
I mean, I still have it. Imposter syndrome, insecurity, abject fear, complete despondency about my lack of ability. On a regular basis, I think I'm a shit songwriter. Why do I bother? This song will never be as good as his or hers. I'm a hack. Mine are superficial and hers are deep. It's endless. It's part of it, like you said. I don't know any creative people who don't have this either. And if they don't, they're not very good, because the hubris just kind of ruins everything. But the way I deal with it is that I know it's there, I recognize it, and also I just feel like even if I don't, and I'm not sure how to explain this, but I feel like every song has its own potential. Like some songs, their cup is really small, but if you can get it full, then you've gotten to what you're supposed to do with that song. Some songs, their cup is much larger, and it requires a lot of due diligence to get that cup full. But as time has gone on, I know when the song has achieved its full potential. And unfortunately, sometimes that's like long after I've recorded it and I go, it's like I smack my forehead and go, oh, it should have been that word or that line. But that's what I aim for. Like sometimes when I start writing something, I go, this is just it's better than mediocre, because if it's really just mediocre, I don't bother. It's okay and it has merit, so I'm going to finish it and take it to its best potential. And then sometimes it's like really inspiring, like, oh God, if I could get to this one, if I could like fulfill this one, it's going to be really good. So I think it's partly the songs that get dropped in your lap. I mean, I've often thought that some songs are already complete out in the ether, and you just have to find a way to pull them in.
Do you think that recording is the end of writing the song?
No, unfortunately not. Sometimes, of course, sometimes it is. It's like you go, that's done. That song is as good as it's going to be, and I recorded it. And sometimes the recording, you go, oh, I could have done it better. Or sometimes the song, oh, I wish I would have changed that line. But, sometimes in concert, I'll change a word or a line in a song that I wrote decades ago, just for the hell of it, just to see how it feels.
Wondering about how your relationship with songwriting and your relationship with writing articles and essays and all that kind of stuff. Are these separate things for you, or does it feel like different avenues toward the same thing?
They're different avenues. Each has its own skill set, but I try to find the lyricism in prose. I try to find the narrative in lyrics. There's melody in prose. If you read James Joyce, it's James Joyce without looking at the title of the book, because he has a certain melodic, there's a key to it, there's a recognizable quality. So I try to find my own melody in prose, and sometimes it's kind of like predictable to me. I try to break out of it. I do love songwriting, that's first in my heart. And it's prescribed to me. There's a rhyme scheme there. It's a structure that you set up at the beginning of the song and try to build your playhouse on that structure.
I wanted to ask about the list, the songs that your dad told you. Were all of those songs really, did they all wind up being very influential for you? Or
they were influential for different reasons. Like, for instance, She's Got You. That was influential because of the way Patsy Cline delivered it. And it was kind of, it was repetitive, and it just was like a puzzle. You broke down each section like a scene, and it was put together very meticulously. The structure of it was tight. So that song was, I got it. That was influential in that way. And I was afraid to approach it because of Patsy Cline's version, which was perfection. But I thought, John kept encouraging me. I said no to that song for a long time. And he said, look, you can bring yourself to this song. You don't have to compare it to Patsy. Other songs like 500 Miles, that song was influential because it tapped into something about early country music and that travel and longing for home, that's a recurrent theme in Appalachian songs and, back to Celtic ballads. And that's a tradition in folk and country music that I really love, because back in the early part of the 20th century and the 19th century, once you left home, you never saw your parents again, you never saw your family again, many, many times. You were just too far away. There was no way to get back. And so that theme is just so profoundly moving to me. So that song was influential because of that. I knew that there was a spot in history, and that resonated for me. It's part of our American collective unconscious. And, Motherless Children, kind of the same reason. It's a theme in early folk and country music that was, it's recurrent, and the suffering in that song, there's a whole history of songs about mother. I actually wrote the foreword to the accompanying book that went with the CD collection of songs about mother that Dust to Digital put out. It's really fascinating. So yeah, they were all influential in different ways for different reasons. And some of them as a songwriter, some of them as a singer, some of them for the history that I valued.
I know there's like an exercise of trying to rewrite a great song or trying to,
Sure.
Are there exercises you do like that have ever actually resulted in something you've kept?
A lot of times I write a lyric, or particularly John, when he's writing music, he will have a kind of inspirational spark or base for it, like this is a Creedence type song, or this is, a Motown type song, or whatever. I'm a little more clumsy with that. I have his musical vocabulary, but not his musical ability, so he can play around with that and find certain voicings, chord changes, harmonics that I might not know how to get to. But obviously I have, just as much knowledge and love of just records and songs. So Sometimes I'll start writing a lyric and lean towards a melody that makes it collapse in on itself. Like sometimes if you're writing a lyric about something that's sensitive or tender or vulnerable, and you put that kind of melody with it, it collapses in on itself. But if you can provide some edge and urgency and contrast with the melody, then it comes alive.
I was thinking, this whole podcast idea came from thinking about influences and how musicians influence each other and various other things that influence songwriting. Mm-hmm. And thinking about the list and this idea of Motown, going for a certain kind of sound, mm-hmm. All the ways that different kinds of music come into the process, even if you're not consciously trying to make a Creedence riff or whatever. Is that something that you spend any time thinking about, or does it come up later when you're listening back to tracks or singing a song later and realizing, so-and-so is coming through?
Both. Sometimes you have an unconscious, it's in your toolbox and it just comes out. It's like I listen to the Beatles enough that sometimes that structure, those melodies are going to come out unconsciously. Sometimes it's intentional, something that's really inspirational. I'll say to John, I want to write something like that, with that kind of beat, with that kind of in your face, urgency. I like that word, urgency. So it happens both ways. Sometimes you recognize it later. Sometimes you start with that as an inspiration. I mean, nobody's going to do anything completely original at this point. There's five stories and Shakespeare wrote them all. And, there's 12 notes, whatever. There's, obviously, the best artists bring their own self to it and their own interpretation and their own use of whatever inspired them. But I think you can trace most things back, or you're part of a tradition anyway. I'm part of a singer-songwriter tradition. I'm not completely original in what I do. Mm-hmm.
But going back to that word urgency, you're not really a political songwriter. I think of you as more of like a storyteller. Songs are very great in narrative structure, but you don't shy away from commenting on the world, or
No.
telling stories that are topical. Like your newer song, Crawl Into the Promised Land, certainly doesn't, mince words. I know a lot of songwriters are afraid to go there because of the shut up and sing thing. Yeah. Do you struggle with that, or is it more like you just have something to say and you're going to say it? And
I don't struggle with it anymore. Yeah. Because I feel urgent, because most of my life has been lived, and I know that regrets I will have at the end of my life will be the things I didn't say or the beliefs I didn't act on, and what is going to happen to me at this point for saying in a song, deliver me from tweets and lies, and having everybody know what it means. What's going to happen? Somebody's not going to buy my record? Or somebody's going to call me a name or insult me. It's already all happened. It sounds so trite, Kim, but you do have to be true to yourself. You do have to have the courage of your own convictions. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point? Just navel gazing. And who was it that said all art is political? I can't remember who said that, but I believe that. All art is political, no matter if it's topical or not, because the point is to change you, or to at least make you reflect on yourself, or make something spark in you that you hadn't thought of before, or inspire your inclination towards compassion or resistance or transmutation of something in yourself.
Yeah, I was thinking, I had asked Steve Earle one time if there's such a thing as writing a song that's not a political statement. And he was like, basically, you have a platform to stand on and something in front of your face that makes you louder than everybody else. So anything that comes out of your mouth is going to be political.
I agree. And also, if you embody yourself, that in itself is a political statement, because you're not going to please everybody, and you shouldn't. And it's going to resonate in some ways, because what people respond to is authenticity and truth. And if that truth will spark something, if it's delivered in a way that is meaningful, everything we're talking about requires discipline too. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to spew out my feelings and that's going to be enough. No, if you're a writer, a songwriter, you have to apply your discipline to it. It's not enough just to be inspired.
So in this year of holding up and having to avoid the world, not being able to perform, not being able to travel, where are songs coming from?
Well, pressure cooker, partly. Fear, outrage, thinking about what is truly meaningful, the uncertainty of the future, treasuring small things, outrage again. There's a lot. I wasn't writing on the road in the last couple of years because I was exhausted and it was too much. So being at home, I've had the privilege of being inspired to write songs.
Do you find, sort of circling back to the idea of place, that just walking around New York, listening to strangers, do you ever come out of those situations with material?
Sure. The song I wrote with Chris Christopherson and Elvis Costello, 8 Gods of Harlem, that came out of hearing somebody on the street, a woman, Hispanic woman, talking to herself, and I thought she said, Ocho Dios. I don't speak Spanish, but I thought that meant 8 gods. And I couldn't get it out of my mind. Why was she saying 8 gods? And she was getting off the A train from Harlem. Why was she saying that? And that led to, I wrote the first verse of that song. I had heard about another shooting in Harlem, and it made sense to me. And so I wrote that first verse. So yeah, overhearing things, reading a phrase or a combination of words that just suddenly hits me, and I write down, stealing surreptitiously.
Are you a museum person? Do museums do it for you?
Yeah, definitely. I love museums. One thing I want to write about, there's this incredible painting of Joan of Arc, and it's massive at the Met. And I think about that painting regularly, so I'm hoping it turns into a song at some point.
Oh gosh, Joan of Arc. There's so many things you can do with that.
Yeah, don't tell any other songwriters.
I feel like there could be a Joan of Arc challenge to every songwriter. See what you can do with that.
Wouldn't that be a so cool idea?
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
So this podcast is called Why We Write, and I realized I hadn't asked you that. Why do you think you write?
I don't think, why I write, I don't think of myself as separate from my writing. I don't think of another life that I have. Like, I'm 5'5", I'm a writer. That's it for me. And I've been a writer since I was 9 years old when I wrote my first poem. But why I write? Because that's who I am, and because of the question I said earlier about we write because the central question is, who am I? And who am I connected to in this world? And what is the future going to bring? And what does the past mean? And who came before me and who will come after me? And what do I owe to them? Which thread should I break? Which should I nurture and add another link to? And what of me will survive? And all of those questions boiled down to who am I? And that's why I write.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Kim. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course.
Why We Write with Kim Ruehl, a podcast featuring conversations with songwriters about songwriting, is produced by Folk Alley and the Freshgrass Foundation, a 501c3 dedicated to creating and celebrating innovative grassroots music. Find out more at folkalley.com. And special thanks to Mike and Ruthie of the Mammals for the use of their song End of Time for our theme music. Find it on their album Million to One, out on Humble Abode Music.